Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this morning's Transatlantic Chamber of Commerce event on the US elections, the reaction to the results so far. My name is Mandy Haig and I'm the International Director here at the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce. And my other role is I'm Vice President of the British American Business Council. So it's been quite a night, hasn't it? So apologies for any raspy voices this morning because we've all been trying to keep abreast of what's been going on. So what I thought I'd do is just give you a little bit of a rundown on what the next hour is hopefully going to look like. So we're going to do a couple of welcomes, introductions, and then we're going to head straight over to our panelists for their reaction to what has happened at the moment. And then what we'll do is we'll go over to a bit of a Q&A if we've got time, but bear with us because as the results or any reactions are coming in, I've got a great team here with me as well. I've got Stephanie Bowes, International Business Manager, and Dan Harrison, our PR Manager, who's going to be feeding in information. So watch this space if anything key comes in. Then we're going to have some final words and then we'll close off, and then let's just see how the next couple of days plays out. Now, if you do have any technical difficulties, please do put that in the chat box because we have our events team as well here to support you with that. And as I said, if we've got any questions, we'll try our best to do those at the end. So I just want to tell you about the next event that we've got coming up with the Transatlantic Chamber. So if you're interested at all, then please do sign up for next week. And this is being sponsored by Brown Jacobson, and it's on data protection rules and how they're changing. So please do have a look at that. And I'd like to now hand over to our President of the Transatlantic Chamber of Commerce, and that is our Professor Julian Beer.
Good morning, Mandy, thank you. And good morning, everyone. It's been a long night and the day's not over yet. We thought it would be very close. And I thought Biden would get in by a very narrow squeak, but it's still not over. I don't think it'll be over for quite some time. I don't think we'll hear today, and it could be days or actually weeks before we find out the result. But absolutely fascinating turn of events overnight, and it's going to be really important to see who actually comes out the other end for us in terms of Brexit and our trade negotiations with the States. Because whatever side wins, it'll be a very different negotiations for us. So I just wanted to say welcome this morning to everybody that's tuned in. And if you've got televisions on in the background and you're trying to keep up with events, please let us know because I haven't got one here. So anything could happen over the next few days. So thanks for tuning in this morning. And I'd just like to pass over to Harry Reilly, who's the honorary chairman of the Transatlantic Chamber. Thanks, Harry.
Thank you, Julian. Thanks, Mandy. And good morning, everybody. The first headline I think I saw this morning was something to do with a red wave. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, but actually it turned out to be the Liverpool result in the Champions League last night. Where to start? I've been doing business with or running businesses in the USA for probably nearly 40 years. I'm not sure I can remember an election quite like this one. And what a roller coaster ride we've had over the last 4 years. A president who stood for me, the president, not we, the people. A president who tried to buy Greenland, who admitted he paid off a porn star, who preferred Vladimir Putin to his own intelligence agencies. A president who's been investigated, impeached, and then cleared. And yet throughout all of that, business and economies have continued to grow until recently because of COVID. I never really envied the unfortunate citizens of the USA less than I do now. They were probably being asked to go to the ballot box, and for the role of the country's president, the leader of the free world, maybe they had to answer the question, who should I vote against? Those who fear Biden will crash the economy are going to have to live with the chaos and vulgarity of 4 more years of Trump. Those who want Trump gone must bear the risk that Biden's program just creates a damage and damages the recovery. There's no empathetic Trump nor a risk-free Biden on the ballot. And the interesting statistic for me yesterday was that a survey of 2,000 Americans revealed 55% of them regarded yesterday as the most stressful day of their lives. Why is this important to us and business in particular? And given the current economic crisis caused by COVID, the world needs the USA, its leadership, its engine of economic growth, and it needs to help to lead the world back to stability. Increasing protectionism, trade wars, not addressing global warming, nuclear issues with Iran, constant bickering with allies has without doubt sapped the Western world. So after fake news, claims, counterclaims, moral outrage, social media barrage, I tried to think about the way this could go on. I was thinking last night, as Julian said, you could have Biden by a whisker. So what happens then? Trump gets the legal team going and fights through to January the 20th. You could have Trump by a whisker, in which case Biden's legal team allege voter suppression, get their legal team involved. A Biden landslide and a Trump one big, that isn't going to happen now. Too close to call. Trump stays in the White House. He's already built the wall. Riots, protests, civil unrest. Certainly a bonanza for lawyers. And then one of the things is that Trump could win on the night but lose by the weekend. And he refuses to go, alleging voter fraud. That is already starting at the moment. What does it mean for us? What about this so-called special relationship? You know, we're a long way from the days of 160,000 Brits immediately after the grim post-war austerity, footing the bill for a statue of Franklin Roosevelt in London. I'm not sure how many Brits today would put their hands in their pockets for a likeness of Donald Trump. Only 19% of Britons have confidence in Mr. Trump to do the right thing. He's criticised this. He's had a go at Boris. He's had a go at us about Huawei. He's had a go at us about Iran. I think our diplomats, who are very diplomatic, have said there have been ups and downs at a political level. And although the relationship does run deep, military, diplomatic, intelligence links, in Britain, we want someone who is a more predictable partner in terms of the UK-US alliance. We want to see an America that stopped turning in on itself and hopefully have a president that can bring the country together. In business, as always, we'd seek to remove uncertainty, variability, and risk so that we can plan and then deliver. Big question about a second Trump term is whether he would double down, unconstrained by electoral concerns, or moderate his behavior as he looked to his legacy. I know which one I'd back. His strategic time horizon is his next tweet. For the UK, that would mean reasonably warm personal relations at the top between the president and the prime minister he once called Britain Trump. More positive noises about Brexit and a future trade deal, but also more disputes over policies such as relations with China, Iran, global warming. It's interesting, Trump succeeded in 2016 because he presented himself as an anti-Obama and anti-Hillary candidate. Part of the reason I thought Joe Biden might win is because he so easily fits the role of the anti-Trump. They're almost polar opposites in everything they do and say. And make no bones about it, this was a culture war election. Each camp believed its opponents would destroy the values it holds most dear. Biden says this is a battle for the soul of America. I think both sides would fervently agree. They just have diametrically opposite views of who will save it. And for the UK, what we're waiting for is a trade deal. The UK, as you all know, currently trades with the US on terms that were negotiated with the EU. But that will change on the 1st of January when the UK stops following EU trade rules. Both the US and the UK are negotiating a trade deal with the aim of making it easier and cheaper to buy and sell goods to each other. Given that the new presidential term doesn't start until the 20th of January, a deal is unlikely to be agreed until then. And when a deal is finally agreed, it will depend very much on the will of the next president. And when it comes to UK export destinations, the US is the UK's second biggest market behind the EU. So, favourable trade deal would aim to lower tariffs, President Trump, who's called himself Mr. Brexit, says he wants a speedy trade deal. Joe Biden wins. This could be a slower process, as he might prioritize repairing US-EU relations. Remember, Mr. Biden was vice president to Barack Obama, who before the 2016 EU referendum said that the UK would be at the back of the queue in any trade deal with the US if he voted to leave. So there's no guarantee of a quick trade deal, no matter who wins. And then there's always those chlorinated chickens, the price of medication, access to the NHS, and what to do with the Irish border. I do have a concern that Biden may crash the economy at a time when we in the UK have been weakened and destabilized by coronavirus and Brexit. I think he's learned from the financial crisis that to get the economy growing again and back on an even keel, bigger and bigger stimulus packages work better than smaller ones. So on the one hand, Britain needs Donald Trump's support for a post-Brexit trade deal, something a Democrat-controlled White House and Congress are unlikely to prioritize. But Trump threatens everything the British government holds dear, especially after Brexit, whether that be NATO, World Trade Organization, global trade, United Nations, environmental protection. These are indeed unprecedented times, and I expect stock market and currency volatility. I would pick up on a couple of things. Walmart last week said that it was temporarily removing guns and munitions from display in thousands of stores in the United States. The Australian Department of Foreign Affairs updated its travel advisory, warning citizens against travel to the US, in part due to anticipated violence. 2020 sure has been an extraordinary year. In the words of Bachman Turner Overdrive from 1974, you ain't seen nothing yet. Back to Mandy.
Wow, Harry, thank you for that. A lot of food for thought there, I think. So I know that you have to rush off now, so you've thrown your grenades in there, and we'll pick them up if that's okay.
Thank you. The pins are out. I'm going to run for it. Thanks ever so much,
Harry.
everybody, and good luck.
Okay, well, after that from Harry, I'm now going to hand over to Professor David Dunn, and David is Professor of International Politics from the University of Birmingham, and I think Professor Dunn is going to share with us a bit more about what a Biden presidency or what a Trump presidency may look like, David. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, but given the result that we had last night, I'll spend a few minutes on that as well. It's worth saying that, just as a preface really, that incumbent presidents usually win. You really have to go back to 1992 when George Bush Sr. was beat by Clinton only because Ross Perot had 20% of the vote. And before that, 1980, when Carter was defeated by Reagan, for a sitting president not to be returned handsomely. But this election has proved to be very divided, and the only continuity that we're going to get, rather between one and second term, is the continuity of division. The result that we've had so far is worth looking at, because that plays into the long term, and that it reflects a divided country. An inconclusive result, even in the short term, is destabilizing. It means that the result will be contested politically, legally, and possibly on the street. It also actually allows Trump to try and delegitimize the entire process, which undermines confidence in the result. It undermines the legitimacy of the result once it's achieved, especially if it's Biden, and it also undermines the democratic process. It's also likely that this divided result will end up with a divided government. It seems that the Republicans are more likely to hold the Senate, and that means that they will be clashing with the House, which is likely to be held by the Democratic Party. And so even if Biden was to win, whoever wins, I think there's going to be divided a government in some form or other. The hope of a clean sweep allowing the Democrats to actually enact a whole variety of legislation for an economic recovery post-COVID, that seems to have gone. So division seems to be the watchword, and that has implications for the capacity to deal with COVID and to deal with the recovery. But also, actually, this result shows how imperfect America's democracy is. If Trump wins, he is likely to lose the popular vote. That will be the third time out of 6 elections that the popular vote has not resulted in the election of the president that the people voted for, because of the way in which the Electoral College skews the result. Similarly, if the Republicans retain the Senate, that will reflect the fact that the Senate, the way it's elected, massively privileges sparsely populated rural white states in the middle, as opposed to where the most of the population is. And this division will also reflect the culture war, in that this country is massively divided, and it's massively divided on demographics. The election of Trump was largely about a reaction to demographic change, the demographic change that resulted in the election of a black man to the presidency, and Trump is the reaction to that. And a lot of what we've seen in support for Trump it has been an attempt to support a notion of America that's a white America. It's a notion of America that's dividing, trying to defend white privilege. If we do get a Trump administration, I think we'll find a very different administration to the one that we had in the first term. In the first term, Trump confounded many of his critics in being affecting less change than many people feared. Okay, there was the repudiation of the Iran nuclear deal, of the INF Treaty, the failure to renegotiate START 2, the Paris Accord on climate change, the trade war with China, the renegotiation of NAFTA. They were all expected, but more was feared. Why was this? Partly because Trump didn't understand government. He still doesn't really understand the way in which the process works. He doesn't actually spend much time doing it. And he has, if you read the recent memoirs of Kim Darroch, the British ambassador to Washington, he says that it's extraordinary the way the White House works, and that there is no plan, there is no strategy, there is no even plan for the week. They roll up at the office about 11 o'clock and say, let's react to events. It reacts to the TV show's agenda rather than setting his own agenda. There's also the case in which initially he appointed people who he deferred to, and this is particularly the case that former military advisors, General Kelly, General Mattis, and others. And actually, also in terms of the military, for example, when he offered, suggested that the North Korean negotiations should result in the war games with South Korea and America being halted, the military worked around that and actually just did them without him knowing. Similarly, the military reinforced NATO as a consequence of Baltic concerns about Russia without him knowing. But actually, a second term would be much more likely to be characterized by a confident Trump, a Trump who isn't constrained by the need to be re-elected, someone who will be interested in his legacy, and that legacy will be pleasing his base and enacting his instincts, which are profoundly problematic in the sense that he's anti-trade, anti-treaty, anti-ally, and someone who actually wants to reinforce the power of the presidency at the expense of other parts of the government. So it's a problem for democracy around the world, to have someone who rides roughshod over every convention, norm, and indeed law in the way in which he deals things. And it's a problem for people dealing with him in terms of that transactional America First agenda. But it's also likely to result in the Republican Party becoming more and more the Trump Party. The Republican Party's always had a tension between being internationalist and trade and free trade focused and international engagement with international institutions like the WTO, like NATO. It supported the EU. It supported the idea of public goods, public international goods, and actually promoting democracy around the world and human rights around the world, and actually being an America that was not about narrow self-interest, but actually about wider goals and wider ideas, the America of the idea. if Trump wins a second term, the Republican Party is much more likely to be a narrow nationalist party, and that will be secured. Even this level of support that Trump's got, even if he loses, that might encourage the Republican Party to go in that direction and to cease being, on a permanent basis, the internationalist party that's been since 1945. What does it mean for UK-US relations if we have a Trump administration? The UK-US relationship has been characterized as a special one because it has had special projects in common. The idea of building the world order from 1941 onwards within the Atlantic Charter to the creation of NATO, the United Nations, and other things. And even in the post-Cold War period, it's about bringing democracy and liberalization and human rights to other parts of the world. If that is no longer in common because the US is no longer interested in those things, then it's much less likely that Britain has a role to actually push larger projects. If America is focused on America first, then how does the UK help that on the global scale? And in fact, actually, it might be in Britain's interests, as has been the case under the first term, where Britain has been much more allied with France and Germany on Iran, on the Paris Accords, on NATO, on world trade. It's much more likely that actually there'll be more divisions between the UK and the US than that there will be a harmony of interest, despite the warm relationship that Boris has tried to cultivate with Trump. But there may be fealty, there may be a sycophantic approach towards the White House, as we saw with Liam Fox this morning, in order to try and get a trade deal. But that trade deal, again, will be on the terms of America first. What they want is access for the pharmaceutical industry, for their farming industry, and for finance, and what the terms they want them on for us are not necessarily in the UK's interest. So that's problematic for a variety of reasons. If we had a Biden victory, and it's still possible that Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are still in play, and if Biden wins any three of those, he still will be president. So it's entirely possible that we still get a Biden victory. And if it is the case that we get a Biden victory, we'll see a very different plan of action. But the ability to enact that, as I indicated earlier, is compromised by the fact that the result is split and is delegitimized, and it will be much more difficult for Biden presidency to make headway and to be the restorationist administration that it sought to be in the way in which it set out its stall. What he wanted to do was to actually heal the divides across the nation, and the income inequality across America is enormous. So what he wanted to bring back was more union rights and more union representation, to bring back better paying jobs to the Rust Belt, and he wanted to reinvest in American industry, and wanted to bring in a green economy, a green plan. And his ability to do that will be compromised somewhat by the fact that the Senate is likely not to be in Democratic hands. So there's problems there. But he will, of course, on foreign policy, re-engage with the Paris Climate Accords. He most likely will try and reinstate negotiations with Iran, and he will deal with North Korea in a different way than Trump dealt with him. And he will be focused on the economy, on healthcare reform, on court reform, possibly on electoral reform. And in terms of relations with Europe, he will be focused on building relations and improving relations with France and Germany. After Brexit, the UK is less valuable to the US in dealing with Europe. Britain's value to America was always that Britain was able to talk on behalf of Europe to America, and also to be able to represent America's position in the European councils. Now that Britain's out of that, the Americans will be forced to deal with Germany and France rather than their preferred favorite of old in the UK. In terms of actually a trade deal, again, it's possible that the UK talks about. Liz Truss the other day was talking about this, saying that the trade deal is ready to go. It's all more or less agreed. It just needs political agreement. But actually, it may well be the case that a Biden administration would not want to do that if it meant actually offending the Europeans. And the bigger question is dealing with relations with the EU, because that's a more important actor than the UK is. So a Biden presidency wouldn't necessarily mean that actually the UK would quickly move to a trade deal on favourable terms. But a Biden presidency would, for the UK, be in its wider interests in terms of climate change and other things. I'll leave it there.
Well, that's really interesting, David. So for us in the UK, you know, it's a bit of a challenge, isn't it, as to who gets in? I mean, how are we feeling then? Is it sounds from what you're saying that the Biden presidency is going to be more towards the EU relationship rather than the UK relationship. Is that what
it depends. It depends how you value the issues. I mean, I don't think a trade deal with the US is I mean, the trade deal with the US will be 0.6% or even less than that of the UK's trade. So it's tiny, it's symbolic, it's politically important for the Brexit project. It's not important for UK's trading relationship in the round. Most of our trade is with and for Europe. The marginal increase of a trade deal with the US is tiny. It's mainly politically important. But a Trump administration would undermine NATO, undermine the WTO, undermine the United Nations, and actually contribute to global warming, which actually endangers life on the planet. So actually, you can't. You have to actually weigh these things rather than count them. And a Trump administration would be massively detrimental to the world order, to the future of democracy, to the future of everything we hold dear. And therefore, there's no real comparison as to who's in which presidency would be in the best interest of the UK or indeed the rest of the world.
Goodness, so we could be in for a very interesting next 4 years then in that case. So thank you.
I mean, transformational.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, Jonathan Strasberg. Now, Jonathan, we were here 4 years ago, weren't we, at Birmingham Airport? And again, really interesting times. And so Jonathan is MD of True Course Law, US attorney, and I'm sure we're in for some interesting insight from you now, Jonathan.
Well, I remember that time 4 years ago. I walked into that room feeling like I had been hit by a bus. Everybody else looked the same. And to be honest, I'm probably one of those 55% that Harry was referring to. Here we are, the morning after the most important presidential election in living memory. We may not know the actual outcome for several days. Meanwhile, the country sits on the edge of panic, wondering whether it's still a full democracy, especially with Donald Trump's premature claim to having won. The election takes place in the backdrop of widespread voter suppression by those very same states that were the raison d'etre of the 1965 Voting Act. Regrettably, that act was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 2013 on the basis that it was no longer necessary, in one of the most unjustifiably and brazen political decisions in recent history, matched only by the court's decision 3 years earlier in the case of Citizens United, which held that corporations are, for matters of free speech and political contributions, people just like you and me, people who need to feed and educate their children, live in safe communities, and have access to medical care. It's interesting to note that since the Voting Rights Act was struck down as unnecessary, over 1,200 polling places in minority districts in various states have been removed, many of them, as we know, in anticipation of this election. I'm inspired by the people that queued 11 hours or more for early voting, producing votes totaling about 96 million, smashing prior records, and in some states surpassing the total votes cast in the 2016 election. The entire country, and for that matter, the world, agree about how important this election is. But what so many people are mystified by is how we got here. Some would say that Trump is an anomaly that has to be removed, after which we can return to more normal and healthy American democracy. I don't think that's correct. Some would say that it's a response to unresolved economic and social fallout from the double gut punch of the financial crisis and globalization. While I'd agree that together these are immediate causes, the financial crisis and globalization have their roots in deeper structural problems in the American democracy. And in that respect, they're as much symptoms as is Trump himself. Finally, some would say that it's just the continued march of a growing radical right in America since the presidency of Ronald Reagan. But that only begs the question of what permitted such a march to actually reach the doorstep of what some people fear might be fascism. For me, the answer can be distilled down to three awful decisions made over the course of the past few decades. Decisions that have led the way for America to move from a country with a government by, for, and of the people to one very, very close to being by, for, and of a corporate oligarchy. The first awful decision under the presidency of Ronald Reagan was his administration's repeal of a law called the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine required that all broadcast news must give fair time to opposing views in politics. After its repeal, broadcast news increasingly devolved from being a public service to becoming entertainment and a source of advertising revenue. The Fairness Doctrine was more than just a law. It was a cultural proclamation that we're a country that valued educated voters and information that they rely upon, and that the people who dispense that information must be accountable to the truth and thereby the welfare of the nation as a whole. In a country like America, with huge swaths of rural, poor, uneducated people, and people often biased along racial, cultural, religious, and nationalist lines, repeal of the Fairness Doctrine and the cultural values it represented paved the way for disaster. An old friend once expressed what sounded to me at the time like an absurd opinion, but I think it has withstood the test of time. He said that American culture is comprised of two things: popular culture and the Bill of Rights, meaning individual rights. The absence of the Fairness Doctrine left American broadcast media to the mercy of the commercial demands of popular culture. News went from being an examination of political affairs, requiring some level of focus and attention, to being a series of loud, colorful, brash, easy to swallow sound bites, requiring a bare minimum of Are you there? Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we've got you back. Thanks,
Okay,
Jonathan.
something went funny there. I was cut off for a moment. I thought Donald Trump heard my speech.
Carry on with your awful decisions made in the last
Right.
decades.
Well, news went from being an examination of political affairs requiring some level of focus and attention to being a series of loud, colorful, brash sound bites. And slowly but surely, the object of broadcast news became the financial benefit of media conglomerates rather than an educated and discerning voting populace. For mainstream media, it was far better that Americans be passive consumers than critical thinkers. And as a result, America over the past 30 years has been a country with a large portion of its citizenry, possibly the majority, unaware of the workings of their own economic and political system, far less those of any other country. And ultimately, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine gave cultural, if not strictly legal, permission for the existence of Fox News, the apex of right-wing popular culture. The second awful decision has already been mentioned, the Supreme Court's 2010 decision in Citizens United, which essentially allowed unlimited amounts of dark, unaccounted for money to flow from corporations and the richest amongst us to party political action committees, known as PACs or super PACs, which essentially campaign for the policies of particular candidates. Now, campaign finance in the US has always attracted legitimate criticism, but Citizens United opened the floodgates of money to completely opaque sources. Before the decision in 2006, dark money contributions totaled less than $5 million. By 2012, that figure increased to $300 million. In the top 10 most competitive Senate races in 2014, more than 71% of outside spending was dark money with no sources revealed. From the year of the court's decision in 2010 to 2018, $2.9 billion was spent on the federal election. And that brings us to this election. In 2020, the presidential race alone is expected to cost a total of $6.6 billion. And when you add in the Senate races and the House races as well, it tops a whopping $14 billion. The bulk of super PAC money comes from just a few wealthy donors. A horrible fact, for example, is that in the 2018 election, which was not for president, it was for the legislature, the top 100 donors to super PACs contributed nearly 78% of all super PAC spending. The question of whether members of Congress are more loyal to their donors than to their constituents or the welfare of the country is a very real, very under-addressed one, and has resulted in many Americans feeling that their votes simply don't count. When we look at the issues like gun control, especially in light of what's happening right now, that impression is most certainly borne out. In addition, because the sources of funds are unknown, it need not be Americans making those contributions. The source can be anyone from any country with any agenda. And yes, that includes foreign actors who have an interest in undermining Western alliances. And finally, the third of the awful trio is gerrymandering. This is a practice whereby voting districts are drawn in such a manner as to fatally dilute the votes of supporters of the opposing party, rendering those votes ineffectual. It's a process that turns democracy on its head. Instead of voters choosing their candidates, the candidates choose their voters. And while both parties are guilty, 4 times as many districts are tilted to Republicans than to Democrats. And this has 2 main effects. It makes congressional incumbents almost unchallengeable, and it inhibits cross-party cooperation. Ultimately, it causes political polarization. By some estimates, gerrymandering disenfranchises about 42 million voters, an amount equal to the combined populations of America's 22 smallest states. And as a side note, hardly a side note, more central note, in 2020, this past year, the Supreme Court ruled that gerrymandering is unconstitutional if it's done with a racist objective. Fair enough. But perfectly constitutional if it's done for political advantage. In other words, if you use the correct label, you are free to disenfranchise whichever American voters you wish. These 3 awful decisions over the past few decades have been at the root of a slow and steady degradation of American democracy. A steady degradation that has been underreported in mainstream press in a manner I find almost criminally negligent. By the time of the 2016 election, of which this 2020 election is part 2, American democracy was far less healthy than it appeared. Like an immunocompromised medical patient, many of the popular vital signs were good. The Dow was up, unemployment was low, consumer confidence was high. But the inner workings, those indicia of political and economic health that are too boring for a revenue-driven 24-hour news cycle, were abysmal, and America was much weaker than it looked. Wealth disparity had reached truly horrific proportions. Wall Street had become an inverse reflection of Main Street. So long as the Dow remained high, it didn't matter that multiple generations in great swaths of rural America were left to wither into hopelessness. America became officially recognized as a very flawed democracy with the lowest level of social mobility of any developed democracy and a huge opioid crisis to boot. Excuse me. Like any other immunocompromised patient, America was highly susceptible to opportunistic parasites. And enter, of course, Donald Trump. History may forever argue about what Hillary Clinton and the Democrats did or didn't do to lose the 2016 election. But just as importantly is the question of what Donald Trump did to not only win the election, but maintain an unwavering loyalty of his base through 4 years of a presidency that undermined not just the country, but the well-being of the very base that supports him. In my view, what Trump did and the mainstream Democratic Party did not do was speak the one fundamental truth required to gain the trust of the tens of millions of those left behind, marginalized, and forgotten in rural and much of suburban America. The one fundamental truth that the country's political and economic system was broken. Trump spoke it over and over again in a variety of ways. And so long as he did, he acquired the license to campaign with a sort of lies, manipulation, hate, and self-service that appealed to the darkest impulses of that 30% of the electorate. The lies didn't matter, the manipulation didn't matter. All that mattered was that he identified with their pain and alienation. He spoke their language. They didn't feel patronized. And very importantly, he was happy to hate whoever they hated. These past few years, it is absolutely no coincidence that the surge in overt racism was particularly acute following 8 years of a successful presidency by an African American. When Trump set about unraveling one by one successive Obama's achievements, he wasn't only indulging his own obsession, he was performing for his base, animating in real time the observation of Lyndon Johnson, who was John F. Kennedy's vice president and successor. His observation that if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice that you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. How ironic then that the feeding frenzy of ignorant scapegoating and deconstruction of democracy, truth, and civility, the unparalleled and open corruption, had all been let loose by the telling of a first fundamental truth, that America was broken. So this 2020 election is both part two of the 2016 election and a reckoning in and of itself. For the last few decades, much of America has slept through the degradation of its democracy. Finally and thankfully, it now seems that many have awakened. I don't know if they've awakened too late. For many people, it's as though the scourge of Trump came out of nowhere. Others, like me, feel that they've been watching it develop for years, wondering when the weight of corruption would finally tip the country into an open rather than latent struggle for its democratic life. So returning full circle to the beginning, none of us know what the next few days or weeks are going to bring, but as for me, I'm fairly certain about two things. First, until America fixes its campaign finance laws, redraws congressional districts in a fair manner, and makes laws to require responsible media, then no matter who occupies the Oval Office, the country will, over the long term, continue its slide away from democracy towards something worse and far more dangerous for its people and possibly the world. And the second point is that if they want to not just survive, but thrive in another election, the mainstream Democratic Party will also be forced to admit that democracy in America is broken. And when they do, they will have no choice but to seriously entertain proposed policies of their own progressive wing. Because I'm not sure I know of any other way to address the poverty, ignorance, and hatred of 30% of the marginalized and forgotten voters. Said another way, the Republican Party has nearly defeated democracy in America by calling upon and indulging the very worst of itself. And the Democratic Party can only rise to this challenge by calling on the very, very best of itself. And that's how I feel.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I'm just thinking about your legal background. I mean, I've just checked in with the team here to see what the results looking like at the moment. So we've got Biden on 220, we've got Trump on 213. And Trump came out just before we went on air to say that, you know, we've won basically, and that the rest of the election would be fraudulent. So what are you thinking with your legal background, how that's going to play out now?
Well, he's already placed an illegitimate seat on the Supreme Court, and he's hoping that that placement was not allowed to rule on some of the counting of early votes or late voting after Election Day. But that may change, and she may be able to tip the balance, but that's unlikely. I'm not nearly expert enough in constitutional law to opine on that, but what I can say is Trump is laying the seeds for a practical win, for sowing chaos. He has a history of sowing as much chaos as possible and then trying to extract from that the best that he can. He is absolutely banking on the ignorance of America. He is absolutely banking upon the worst impulses of Americans. I think this is only partially a legal issue. The gun shops in America have sold out their stock 3 times over the past few months. 3 times they've emptied their shelves. There's actually a bullet shortage in America right now. Every city is boarded up. We are the home of the free and the brave, right? And we're about to find out whether we really are. I was raised being fed that we're the best country in the world. And none of us ever questioned that for most of our lives. And we so didn't question it that we didn't really pay attention to the news. We just watched sitcoms. And somehow we've been dumbed down. And I think it's a big wake-up call to Americans that they have to wake up and they need some information and they have to think critically. I was watching the BBC coverage this morning versus the CNN coverage. And it was like watching the difference between a serious news program and the Super Bowl coverage. I'm sorry to say. Anyway, I think it's partially a legal problem, but no, I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen.
Okay. Well, I'm going to put it out there now to the audience to come forward with any questions that they've got of both yourself, Jonathan, and also yourself, David, on a political side of things. So we'll just wait for those to come in. David, I was just going to ask you really about the, you know, and Jonathan's just touched on it there, about the reputation of the USA and how you feel that that's going to play out depending on how we've, you know, whoever gets this presidency now. So what do you think will be the main impact? And thinking about, I think Jonathan said about a more confident Trump, or you may have said that earlier.
I think David said that. I think David said that.
About the confidence. And do you think if President Trump does get in for his second term, that there will be a complete change in behaviour there as how he's going to portray himself, and look at how the reputation of the US can then be reviewed?
So the first, so it was John Winthrop who described America as a shining city on a hill, and America has, in the post-war period, sought to live up to those ideals by pushing system goals rather than national narrow self-interest. And what we've seen over the last 4 years is a repudiation from that, an abdication of the leadership role that America sought in the world to actually put system goals above individual goals. Trump's not interested in that, and America's reputation has been sullied. The mystique of America has been diminished. Joseph Nye talks about soft power, the power to make people want to imitate you. Well, actually, what we've seen over the last 4 years, and the last year in particular, and actually during this election campaign, America's version of democracy has been shown to be massively tarnished and imperfect, as Jonathan also spoke on. And what that does is it diminishes America's power in the world, diminishes America's reputation in the world. And what it does do is pave the way, and China has acted on this, for other world powers to actually assert themselves and put forward other models of government, and to actually put forward as saying that actually that's no way to run anything at all. And the first presidential debate was shown in China, and Chinese were saying to the people, "This is democracy. This is what you want." Yeah, and absolutely, America's image in the world has been tarnished, and will be further so if we have a second Trump term, because as I indicated, a second Trump term will be, I mean, Trump's already on steroids, and his presidency will be on steroids in terms of actually doubling down on that transactional approach to international engagement and delivering it may well be the case that actually Trump's focus turns to actually building a dynasty. There's talk of Trump Jr. or Ivanka being the candidate lined up. Trump wanted Ivanka to be his running mate, to be his vice president. It was only the Republican Party that actually prevented him from doing so. But actually, he will be trying to build that dynasty. Again, moving beyond democracy, moving towards a dynastic establishment, as we see in other parts of the world. North Korea is an example that comes to mind.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that because you know, some would say that he's done okay with North Korea and trying to, you know, affect that relationship maybe.
Only those who aren't paying attention, I think, would say that. What he did was make major concessions to North Korea in the form of actually ordering the end of military exercises and giving the concession of meeting Kim Jong-un on 3 occasions, when actually every other president said you only get to meet the incumbent in the White House if you have made tangible progress on disarmament before that. So there's nothing being gained in that relationship. Kim is still building ballistic missiles and still building nuclear warheads. All that happened with the North Korea example was that Trump manufactured a crisis and then backed off the crisis, having met Trump and given concessions to North Korea. That's not progress. That's just inept and very poor statesmanship.
Thank you. And we've had a couple of questions come in. We've had some great comments, so thanks for all your feedback in the chat box as well from the audience. But I've got a question here from Naeem Arit, and it's about hearing the concerns of the panelists, particularly from yourself, Jonathan. Why is Mr. Trump still getting such a lot of votes? And more worryingly, what does that say about 50% of the population?
If you look back to writers like H.L. Mencken, Aldous Huxley, Carl Sagan, they've been speaking in one form or another about an underbelly of America, an underbelly, and you can characterize it as you wish: anti-intellectualism, racism, short-sightedness, or whatever. We have a problem in America that we haven't really paid attention to. And Trump has played to that in the first term of his. In his first term, what I hope is his only term. The question is, what's going to happen? Well, if you look at his first term, Trump spent probably 3/4 of it slowly conditioning the country to more and more irrational behavior. Every time he hit a new threshold of bizarreness, that became a new normal. And he had to go through that exercise in order to get to the podium today and say, I won, regardless of what the vote said. He couldn't have said that a few years ago. He had to recondition the American public, the news media, the pontiffs, and the talking heads to consider that a new normal and to talk about it as though it were political discourse. And if he has a second term, he's going to go from being a narcissistic psychopath well, he was a narcissistic psychopath on a bit of a leash, and that leash will be gone. He's going to be a rabid. He's going to turn rabid. As David said, he has no plans. He has no understanding. He has no long-term gain. He's utterly self-interested. He uses his base to increase his own power, and his base is enthralled with him. What? Because there's hate in the world. I don't know the answer to that question. Because if we don't take care of the most vulnerable in our populations, they will turn against us. If we don't make our countries and our political systems reasonably fair for all of us, then they're not going to operate, and it'll come out as resentment. And
yeah,
that's it. Can I ask that question? I think just to make 4 points. In political science, especially in elections, we talk about low information voters. People who actually are very poorly informed and have a very, and so you see this saying, oh, I'm voting for Trump because he's a fantastic businessman. The guy wasn't a fantastic businessman. He's massively in debt. He went bankrupt 6 times. If he had invested his father's legacy in a tracker, he'd have made more money than he actually made in his own businesses. And he only managed to make any money at all due to deregulation of the property market in New York when rent control was lifted. Who couldn't make money in Manhattan under those circumstances? So that's the first point. The second point is that actually he has consistently fed a diet of lies about COVID, about a whole variety of things, and gone largely unchecked by half of the media, who are entirely complicit in the way in which they report him and don't challenge him and those things. Then there's the stock market and the economy. A lot of people say, I'm voting because we have a strong economy. And they assume because he is the incumbent, it's a consequence of his stewardship of the economy. Several things to say on that. The one thing he did was give a massive corporate tax cut. And what that is to borrow money from the future, because it makes America massively indebted going forward. But in the short term, it's a boost. But the main boosts to the economy come from the quantitative easing following the 2008 crash, and the fact that shale gas and fracking has meant that actually America has become independent in domestically produced fuel, which has hugely reduced people's fuel bills, and that's been a major spur to the economy. Now, those things have happened independent of Trump. They precede him, but he's claimed the credit for those, and people have, because that hasn't been analysed, because that hasn't been explained, people have assumed that actually this guy is good for the economy. Well, he's actually allowed COVID to run right in a way that will devastate the economy, and he has no plan for how to do this. This is the first election in American history when the Republican Party has not put forward a platform, a manifesto of what they plan to do. It's all down to Trump. It's all, and then the fourth point I want to make is it goes back to the culture wars. What Trump did was to say it's all right to be racist. It's perfectly fine to actually demonize your enemies in this way. It goes back to that idea of white privilege and Trump being a reaction to demographic changes and to empower those people who don't like the way America is going because of the deep-seated racism that is part of the fabric of American life. After 400 years of slavery, 40 years of civil rights has a lot more work to do to erase that background. And that's the context of this administration. And that's partly, for all those reasons, why people have supported this president in this way. As well as Jonathan's point, of course, crucially, he recognized that the system was broken without offering a solution to it.
Well, thank you both for your honesty and insight this morning. I'm sure we could just keep going and going on this subject now. I'm just going to check. We've had nothing further come in whilst we've been on. So on that, I'm going to hand over now, because I'm just conscious of the time for everybody, over to President Julian Beer. Thanks so much to you both, and over to you, Julian.
I think the one thing we can say is I am actually the president now, and I don't need a bunch of lawyers to say I am. I was voted in, so that's clear.
Democratically, yeah, as well.
Absolutely right. Yes. Yeah. Thanks for our speakers this morning. Very thought-provoking, and to be very interesting over the next days and maybe next couple of months if we run into January, as Harry was saying earlier, before a decision is made. But the stark reality is, for the UK, we've got to play the team in front of us, as the old football saying goes. And in terms of negotiations, we've got to keep going in terms of negotiating a deal with whoever emerges at the other end. David said, the American trade is only quite small, but for the West Midlands, it's significant. It is the biggest, I think, in terms of our relationship, in terms of surplus in trade relationships. So it's very important to the West Midlands, that relationship. And I hope we can secure a good deal with whoever emerges at the end of this process. So I'd like to thank everybody for participating this morning, and for everybody that logged in. There's been quite a number, and thank you all. Have a good day if you can. Thank you.
Thank you very much.